response to this was so overwhelming that NWMI took this forward and set up this particular series.
Any contract that diminishes your rights from the Working Journalist Act is an illegal.
If things continue like this for next 2 or 3 months, it's going to be difficult for everyone.
As you're going through this kind of an extreme situation, things are suddenly crumbling and things are falling apart.
Without a doubt, caste has always played an important but silent factor in the
first thing is don't resign. Once you resign, you've accepted whatever they've given you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Network of Women in Media in India webinar for journalists on Spotlight on Our Rights. My name is Mekhi Sitlo. I'm an independent journalist based out of Guwahati. We're really thankful to all the panelists as well as all the participants for joining us this afternoon. We're living at a very unprecedented time of the pandemic, such a time where a lot of our infrastructures, a lot of industries have been put to a very grueling test, and the media industry is really no exception in this regard. We've seen several countries since they've gone into lockdown, where different newsrooms and a lot of journalists have been laid off, furloughed, and even made redundant, with entire bureaus as well as country offices shutting down. In fact, the most crucial time of our lives, when social inequalities are surfacing in the response to the pandemic, and those in power need to be held in account, journalists are losing their jobs. Before we begin to get into the details of this and into the thick of it, I would just like to request Supriya Oni Nair, a fellow NWMI member, to give us a quick recap of what we discussed in our last webinar. Over to you, Supriya.
Hi, I'm Supriya Oni Nair. As Mekhi said, I'm an independent journalist from Bangalore and I'm an NWMI member. Welcome again to our webinar series, Let Down in Lockdown, hosted by the Network of Women in Media in India. You might know that NWMI was set up 18 years ago as a forum where women working in media could share information and resources, exchange ideas, and help protect media standards and ethics, as well as promote gender equality, both within society and in the media. The network soon branched out, and over the years, it has come to represent journalists across the nation. In the background of the COVID-19 pandemic, Indian journalism has gone through traumatic times, with hundreds losing their jobs. After the first round of layoffs in the media, NWMI members Raksha Kumar and Durga Nandini offered to lend an ear to those affected by opening up their DMs on social media to whoever wanted to speak with them. The response to this was so overwhelming that NWMI took this forward and set up this particular series. The first webinar was held on May 30th and focused on how to cope with job losses, pay cuts, and fewer freelance gigs. Ironically, stories on media retrenchments have seen little visibility in our media. Our first session addressed the ambiguity and the clandestine manner in which these retrenchments had been done. The petition filed by journalist bodies questioning the arbitrary action of media houses against employees was also discussed at length. A support group, Network for Protection of Journalists' Rights, or NPJR, has been set up and is in touch with a large number of journalists who have lost their jobs. A lawyers' network is also in place, and this offers counsel and legal assistance for such people. Panelists at the last session also tapped in on their personal experience and gave tips on how best to cope in the event that someone is laid off, and on how to hone skill sets in order to move forward. Today marks the second of our webinar series. So without any further ado, back to our moderator, Mekhi.
Thank you, Supriya, for that recap. I will quickly just introduce the panel of speakers we have today. We've got Dhanya Rajendran, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of the News Minute; Hartosh Singh Bal, who is the political editor of Caravan magazine; M.J. Pandey, a senior journalist and a member of the Brihan Mumbai Union of Journalists and the Joint Action Committee to implement the Majikya Wage Board Award; and Somnath Vaishya, who has worked for 23 years in the corporate sector with Indian and global MNCs leading HR. He now runs his own gig, providing strategic HR advisory and coaching. So just to quickly, dive into this, Dhanya, I want to start with you. As someone who's been running a very successful digital startup for a couple of years now, and it's really become a model unto itself for several aspiring and mushrooming startup news websites, does this response to, from the legacy and mainstream media surprise you in terms of these layoffs, as well as this kind of like termination that's happening right now? Also, are digital and news websites doing any better in this regard, or what?
So broadly, Makepeace, first to answer your question, all media houses are doing badly as far as revenue is concerned. That's the same for television, print, digital, anyone. For example, on a website like ours, you would see the ads, right? Like 3 or 4 ads on the website. The kind of money which we would have got per click for these websites, for each click on the ads, that has itself come down a lot during the lockdown, considering that the bigger brands are not advertising anymore, even if it's on Google or whatever it is. So even for digital media, I'm saying, even if our page views are still the same, even if people are reading us, the revenue from people reading us has gone down substantially during the whole lockdown period because advertisers are not there. So yes, revenue has gone down for all media, but I do have issues with the kind of layoffs which are being done by big media houses and the way the layoffs have been done. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that perhaps many of these media houses do not, at least a few of them, don't have money to pay salaries for all the people that they had hired over the years. So some of the layoffs were necessary for them. Okay, acceptable. But there are many media houses which I think had enough leeway to allow these people to continue. They could have just done with salary cuts for most of the other employees, of all the employees, and still chosen not to lay off. So these media houses do not want to give a termination letter, don't want to show it as layoff. They want the employees to resign by themselves, and they make these calls through WhatsApp, video calls through WhatsApp, which people do not record, right? Or there are no apps record WhatsApp calls. So for media houses that are forever reporting on unethical layoffs in other industries, we have been so quiet on what's happening in our industry because most of the media houses are complicit. So while I do agree that revenue has come down and media houses have to do cost cutting, including, for example, Newsminute, we only have around 40 employees. And over the years, our whole agenda has been that we will remain a small organization because we don't want this kind of a situation where we'll have to sack people. So we never ever hire too many people. We always stayed small, which has sort of helped us. We can go on with the same amount of staff, but sadly we cannot do freelance articles now. We may not be able to give salary hikes this year, but at least we will not be cutting anyone's salary. So I think this also tells media houses to do long-term planning. Otherwise, we will be laying off more and more people.
Would you say that the news websites have a slightly better contingency plan in place?
See, I think most news websites, the ones which had a larger number of staff, they had already done one round of layoff last year.
Right.
And most of them, when people were quitting, they were not filling those vacancies. They understood that it's better to run a tight, small ship. But I know that if things continue like this for next 2 or 3 months, it's going to be difficult for everyone. Because like I said, for digital media houses, the ad revenue has really plummeted. So if it does not become better in the next 2-3 months, even maintaining that small amount of staff is going to become difficult.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Hartosh, I'd like to bring you in here as someone who fought this legal battle, who sort of faced this kind of brunt years back when you were terminated from Open Magazine. And of course, for this very, very publicized legal battle, which you, of course, came out from victorious. What are your views on the situation right now? And do you think that the industry has gotten worse for journalists, especially since layoffs and trimmings, as Dhanya just said, has been happening even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit?
Look, quite apart from my personal experience, what it means to fight a lawsuit and the kind of pressures it entails and the difficulties that are involved, I'll come back to that. There's a larger context in which Dhanya was speaking, and I'll just reiterate that the only thing I do want to emphasize in that context is what is happening today, the manner of sacking, in the way that sackings are done, is not new. This has become established industry practice over decades. We've had layoffs happening. Hindustan Times has closed editions across Patna, Lucknow, without a noise being made. We've had layoffs from reputed digital organizations which we respect, which have followed the same principles as Times of India in terms of laying off or responsibility or questions. So it is not simply a question of one media house, this has become industry practice on how we treat employees. And the pushback from employees has been very difficult because it's difficult to coordinate. The calls are made, people are given ultimatums, people don't have places to turn to, they respond in that fashion. But this, what the Times of India or the Hindu or the Hindustan Times, and I will take names because it's important to take names, we have seen layoffs over the past. This includes Scroll, this includes Wire, this includes many other organizations where similar things have happened, because we must ask questions across the board of organizations as to on what basis are layoffs done. NDTV. Let's also stay with the organizations that have done it, where the questions have to be clear. What is the basis for layoff? What is the plan for layoff? What are your revenue projections? How have you selected the people you are laying off? These are the first questions before we look at the rights that are granted to people who are being laid off, what rights they have to protect. Where are the questions to organizations on the basis on which decisions are being made? This has become industry practice over decades. We will today turn around, and I hope we will turn around and ask these questions, but we must continue to ask these questions when they are happening across the board at all times. Right now, there's a crisis in the media, especially for print, and we are all aware of it. We at Caravan are facing that same crisis. More and more, our only response is that we need to move away. This is a crisis in the print industry that is not restricted to today. It's not going to go away in 3 months. It's here to stay. And more dependence on ad revenue is going to decline. The direct dependence on subscribers on digital is going to happen. Those are different questions. But I mean, the culpability of the industry is entire and it goes back years. That is the crisis we are seeing today. And this responsibility or accountability we must seek across from every media. That if you are laying people off, if there is a financial problem, first of all, please provide a rationale and a plan on what basis this is happening that justifies which people you pick, what you are doing, who you are laying off. After that, we come to the question, if people are being laid off, what are their rights under the law, including the Working Journalist Act? On which grounds can you lay them off? Can you justify it? What recourse do they have to get the best deal they can under the circumstances? I think these are both necessary questions.
Right. I do want to follow that up with asking you that, while these layoffs prior to the pandemic have been reported, mostly what I've also seen is in these, in these reported pieces that journalists speak to, the author of the record, and they tend to not voice themselves out actually openly or publicly. Why do you think that is the case?
The constant fear is, first of all, what is happening to an individual when you are laid off? You are not only fighting a legal battle, okay? And for all that we may say, and I think it's necessary that from what I've heard that there are groups and people being organized. I think right now there is also a window in terms of Working Journalist Acts where the Supreme Court, I think, still has a guillotine in terms of the time frame in which those cases have to be decided. But that is only a recent thing. My case got decided because of that guillotine. But when you fight a case, it stretches over years, and that's a lonely battle. People may tell you otherwise. People will support you initially when you go to court. There will be a response when you end up winning the battle or losing the battle. Those in between 5 years, as far as I was concerned, or most people who go through the battle, are your own. In the middle of your work, to land up at court, to deal with the arbitrary practices of courts, dismissals, hours, lining up there, it's not an easy matter. It's frustrating. There are expenses involved. It's not an easy battle before anybody tells you that going to court is an easy battle in any sense, which is why it needs community effort. It needs a set of lawyers working and a long-term follow-up. It can't be that people intervene and for 2 months they are interested in a case and then everybody forgets. And that is usually what happens. That is where I think we need to stick with it. And that's not an easy matter for individuals in that place. Why don't individuals speak up? Because while they are going through this process, they are also worried about getting their next job, of making ends meet. That next job must also come from this industry. If you're speaking up about this industry, I was lucky that in the middle of this legal suit, Caravan actually gave me a job and I had money to make my living. In any case, by the time action against me was taken, I had access to being able to write columns, generate my own government. But mid-level journalists who cannot do that are most vulnerable because they have fully staked themselves in the profession. They have payments to meet, mortgages, children's education. And on the other hand, the worry that you will not get a next job and you are fighting a case if you decide to go down that route. In that position, how do you ask somebody to speak up openly about what is going wrong? It is actually an unfair expectation. That expectation should be not on the person who's dismissed, but on the rest of us who are in our jobs, who have the ability to speak up and say things and speak on behalf of the profession or the industry.
Right, absolutely. I think talking about community efforts, it's a good time to bring in MJ here. I'd really like to also know here and for you to kind of highlight this changing employee-employer relationship that we've been witnessing in the industry, where we first saw the move towards the wage board and then to a contractual tie-up, which is now essentially become an acceptable practice across the board. So has the Working Journalists Act essentially been made redundant here?
First of all, I'd like to thank NWMI for getting me on board this webinar. I also like to make a disclosure that I'm the partner of Geeta Seshu. So once I made those disclosures, I'd like to just make my comments around three large areas. One is the practical area. And the practical area is basically the rights that are available today to sets of journalists. As far as the print media is concerned, newspapers as well as news agencies, very well-defined rights are available under the Working Journalists Act, under the Industrial Disputes Act, under the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act. These three acts confer a lot of rights to the working journalists who are there in what we call the legacy media. As far as the contract employees in the legacy media are concerned, my argument is that they are also eligible to act under these legislations. Why? Because there is no, tenure-like contract in these acts. If you go through all the three acts that I've mentioned, Working Journalists Act also mentions only whole time and part time. There's nothing like contract. In the Industrial Standing Orders Act, 5 types of tenures are described, from permanent to probationer to part-time to apprentice, but there is no mention at all of contract. So to my mind, if someone decides to challenge his or her contract, we could get a favorable decision, but the problem is no one ever wants to challenge their contract when they have one. And if you don't have a contract if you don't have a contract employee with you, a union does not have locus standi to challenge that contract. So that has been the eternal problem for unions. Why we've not been able to do away with the system which has been with us since the late 80s. And so I would say there are 3 kind of disruptive moments which we have to be aware of. The first disruptive moment for journalists to understand is the 1950s with the formation of the Indian Federation of Working Journalists. That is a disruptive moment from below, where the workers got together, editors worked with them, they formed an organization, they got the government to form the first press commission. The commission gave its report and we got the act in 1955. So that was a disruptive moment, but that was a disruptive moment from below. What we find is after that, there have been 2 large disruptive moments. One in the late 80s, and the main disrupting agent then was the Bennett Coleman and Company. They brought in for the first time contracts on a wholesale basis. They introduced a newspaper called The Independent. And through that, they first brought in the contract system into the journalist world. Okay, this was the late 90s. And then that became a pattern. As they say, all bad things start with Bennett Coleman. Once they do something, everyone starts adopting their tactics. And then the third disruptive moment, I feel, is the winning of the battle for the Majithia Wage Board. That is 2014. The Supreme Court decides that this wage board has to be implemented across the board. It is even applicable to contract employees in terms of the variable pay that has to be given to them. Now, once this decision comes, the body of the newspaper owners, that is the INS, Indian Newspaper Society, that decides that no, this cannot go on for long. And if you see from 2014 to date, Not a single newspaper has implemented the wage board in toto. Not a single newspaper establishment. So the bugles were sounding from 2014. Okay. And once you see, if you trace these disruptive moments, they also have disruptive elements in terms of technology. The first one was basically in the 50s, where you had the Fordist model being adopted for technology, large factories, composite factories. There's a press on the ground, in the basement. There are journalists working on the first floor, the ad department on the marketing on the second. That kind of structure, if you see, that was the first structure. With the coming of computers and change in communication technology, you found that that led to a change in relations with the contract system coming in the late 80s. And now we find that again, where technology has changed, there's internet, there are all these other disruptive technologies, we find there is a move to again change the relations from a kind of contract system to a casualization. What we are moving towards is a casualization of labor among journalists. So we will find that in the future, you will have a very small nucleus of people who have some kind of contract or some kind of tenure, and there will be a large periphery which will basically be casual. Already in Bombay, senior people are writing at the rate of 1,000 rupees an article. And we have been predicting this for several years, saying that, unless there is, as Sartosh also was saying, that there has to be some collective opposition to this. If you stand alone, you cannot resist, you cannot withstand. It's the systemic problem with the years it takes to go through court. Even in the wage board, the court has said it should be done within 6 months. Not a single case has been decided within 6 months. They all take, even today, between 3 to 5 years, the wage board matters. So the systemic pressures are there. Then I'd like to talk about the emotional ecosystems that have developed. People are complex. Journalists, including, are complex. It depends on what kind of environment they have at their workplace, in their families, with their partners, whether they're supportive enough, what kind of stuff. To fight is not simple. So we know when we are tackling these things, we also need to keep an eye on this, that the emotional ecosystems that have developed around people, especially intellect workers from the middle class, they are not conducive to taking up these battles. It has almost become a normative code of conduct not to get into unions, not to fight managements. You tend your own garden and you'll be happy. So this kind of ecosystem has developed over the years, and this is one concrete problem actually which face. We get hundreds of calls every day asking for information about their rights, but in the end, nothing gets done. People collect their dues, and I suspect it is partly due to this emotional ecosystem, which is like even their own colleagues. Even if we take the role of editors have become more or less agents of the management. You see, they actively tell people, no, don't, you just take your dues, look at your career, stuff like that. And they also play that dampening role, people not wanting to take up their injustices. The last thing that we need to do also is, as I told you, the disruptive moments, they're part of a kind of philosophical attitude. Unless you understand what is happening in journalism, how technology is operating, how those relations are changing, and within that value change, how managements are seeking to enforce change. These are all pressures from above that are coming one after the other, and there is no reaction at all from below, which is largely the situation in India. If you see what happened to the migrant workers, if you see what has happened to the laws of India, the Working Journalists Act, which we are talking about, is being done away, by the way. With 4 new codes that are coming, the Working Journalists Act is going to be repealed. So this is the overall context within which we are operating. Everybody, I think, knows what their rights are, but it is at the subjective element that there is a problem. People are not able to decide. They don't find that they have support systems which are which are there to help them tide over the crisis. And that is why we are left to individuals like Artosh and maybe this colleague from Kerala. 1 or 2 people, they get up and they fight, but the majority of them are not fighting. We need to understand it in a more complex way. It's not just an explication of rights. It's something more complex.
I just want to bring in like the most recent, round of layoffs that happened in the Hindu, where I read that a lot of them who were actually on the wage board, compromised on that and actually agreed to, sign a contract with the company. I'm just wondering, like, I'm sure you've had conversations with a few of them. What may have dissuaded them,
See, what happens is, there is something called due process. As I said, for the newspaper industry, due process is very clear. It's well established. Managements are seeking to circumvent due process. Now, if you don't want to oppose it, what can one do? I'll just give you a small checklist. If you want to retrench somebody in an organization like the Hindu, the first thing you have to do is put up a seniority list of that the particular department, which they don't. What they're doing is they're picking and choosing. So that is against Section 25G of the Industrial Disputes Act. Clear violation. But the thing is, they are violating due process of law. Someone has to get up and say, okay, we won't let you get away with this. If you don't do that, we'll keep on explaining the law. That's why I can have a nice half-an-hour session with you just explaining the laws under the 3 acts. But unless somebody decides to stand up and be counted, things are not going to move. The problem is there. Basically, they are defeating due process of law. If you want further, me to dilate on that and talk about various sections, I can do that. But what they're basically doing is they're not giving retrenchment compensation. The first thing is retrenchment compensation amounts to 15 days of notice pay for every year of service. So someone who's done 10 years will get 5 months pay at his last average pay or her last average pay. So immediately you're diddling the person out of 5 years. Very often they don't give gratuity. Gratuity again is the same. Another 5, if she has done 10 years, another 5 months. So can you imagine, just by giving your 3 months wages or taking a resignation, the company is seeking to save 10 months wages. That is only at the level of money. But it's more than that. You need to take permission. Hindu has more than 100 employees. It also has a press. Now it gets covered by Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act. Under Section 25(9)(n), if you want to retrench a single person, you need to make an application to the appropriate authority 60 days before you retrench that person. Okay, 60 days. They don't want to do all that because we will go and object and the permission will be rejected. You see, that is how due process is being defeated. They're just circumventing due process. It's not only money. They will not get permission at all to do it.
Right. We are hearing a lot of, obviously, standoffish attitude towards the management. I'd like to bring in Somnath here. Since of course HR is very much seen as a part of the management here, and they're often sized down to this role, a very mechanical task of just collecting or handing out papers, pink slips particularly. I'm just wondering what more should they ought to be doing, and can employees or journalists in fact see HR as somewhat independent of the management?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And actually, I'm very impressed to see the views which have already been shared by the eminent panelists talking about issue which is of great relevance. So, I've been told to represent the HR side of it, which I think in recent times has been viewed more than being human resources, has become kind of a hidden resource kind of a thing, right? So I think that's the angst which is going on in the minds of a lot of people. But to me, it's not surprising. Means I have been out of the corporate scenario lately, kind of a thing. And as I've been observing what's happening across the different sectors of industry in this kind of a situation, I feel that there's a larger structural problem over here. And when as a student of engineering long back, I remember when we studied structures, we studied that we build structures with a certain margin of safety, so that when there are exigencies, the structure can withstand that exigency. And the current pandemic is truly an exigency. Means I'm sure down the line of many years from now, this will be talked about in the same way we talked about the Great Plague or the Spanish flu. Of course, I don't want to make things worse than what it is, and I do hope that we get past this entire thing at the earliest possible. But why I'm trying to talk about it is in the context of people management in the entire media and the entertainment industry. I think this factor of safety has not been built in, and as you're going through this kind of an extreme situation, things are suddenly crumbling and things are falling apart. And in fact, not only the factor of safety, I think there were glaring fault lines which have been visible for quite some time. And we have conveniently chosen to ignore some of these or not look at some of these because, things were going good kind of a thing and the sun was shining. So let me just elucidate a couple of those to make sense of what I'm trying to talk about. I think the first flaw which I want to highlight is a flaw around governance, leadership, and org design. I think that's where HR also has a role to play. Kind of, unlike many other industries, this is one where it's very promoter-driven kind of. The professional management is not as mature as we get to see in some other sectors. Kind of. What happens in this kind of a scenario is that it's more about it's about leaders trying to pass through what they think and what they feel, and it's not only HR but other functions also, the enabler functions, whether it's finance, marketing, etc. None of these are able to thrive. None of these are able to think. They are reduced to more being order takers or administrators of a decision or executioners kind of a thing. They are brought in much later into the decision process. And, you just were to relate to that situation, if, the best of talent in some of these disciplines then would not really want to associate with this sector of industry. They would want to stay away. And the ones who actually come in, they are the ones who are more adept to more of the execution and the administration of a decision which has already been made. These people are not readied or they are not enabled to face a contingency situation that we are going through presently. And it's not a surprise that, they are not visible at this point of time because they are waiting to get the signals or the directions as to how to react, how to manage through. And again, I'm not generalizing the situation because I have had colleagues who have been extremely great CHROs in the media and entertainment industry sector, and I have huge respects for them. But what I'm trying to say is that such kind of talent in this industry segment is rarer and than what I get to see in some of the other segments. So there's an larger issue with the talent readiness or the HR readiness to handle something like this. The second thing which I wanted to highlight as a flaw is the way this industry has grown or matured. There's a growth flaw. There's been a mushrooming kind of a growth with the number of media houses, the number of TV channels, etc. kind of, right? It's not been a sustained model of growth. I have also seen that how multiple institutes have flourished in recent years, which are doling out diplomas and degrees to talent through 1-year courses, 2-year courses in journalism, which has meant that the entry barrier for talent has been absolutely quite low out here. Again, what happens in this kind of a situation is that the talent comes in, but then is not set up for a longer term success in terms of how to grow ahead. And again, if you bring in from an HR concept where you have HR, which is more driven in terms of an execution mindset or an administration mindset, they really are not thinking of the higher ends of HR, which is about growth, career development, succession planning, some of those things. So you're not readily setting up talent for a longer term success over here. And when something like this happens, they are not ready to make a crossover to other sectors of society or to find out alternate jobs. And suddenly it's like faced with a situation we don't know how to handle. And finally, the other thing which is possibly relevant is a flaw around how the culture operates in some of these, in this sector kind of, and as you already heard from what I've just said, it's a culture where it's a followership culture because, a lot of people are used or are made to just take orders and just to react, not to be thought partners at the table kind of a thing. So there's a followership culture. There's more of a tell culture rather than, participate and influence culture. I also think that, I could be wrong here, but whatever my limited understanding of this industry is that, there's a lot of cutthroat competition. It's about how do I become the first to break the news to the audience, how I am, so it brings in a kind of an individualistic culture rather than a team kind of a culture in this industry. And finally, I feel that, when you operate on a longer term around in some of these ways, where decisions are made very ad hoc, there are not proper processes to guide some of these decisions. It's led by one person or a couple of people kind of a thing. then what happens is that there is a trust deficit which happens, and the equity in this kind of a setup starts dwindling. So there is a lack of accountability. There is a lack of people owning up, a negative decision which is to be made, and everybody gets into a hiding mode, passing on the buck to someone else to possibly complete it, kind of a thing. So if you put all this together, I'm not surprised that, there's a feel that HR has not shown up in a very responsible way in terms of handling some of these conversations, showing the respect and the dignity that is required around some of these changes. Maybe some of these changes are justifiable because the industry is possibly going through a reset. We are all going through a pandemic. But even considering all those, there has to be an element of respect. There has to be an element of ownership. But I'm not surprised that that's not happening because the entire thing has not been set up in a right way from a longer period of time. And I am reminded of a quote which the chairman of Intuit used to make when I was there, is to say that, the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. And what we are encountering now is a huge downpour or a thunderstorm which is happening. And it's not a surprise that the leak is only getting bigger and bigger, kind of a thing, because we have not readied, or we have not created a readiness in the HR organization to be able to handle some of these realities.
I think, somewhere to perhaps, comfort us or even reassure us, would you be able to recall any time or any particular example of an HR professional who may have perhaps gone even against company or management interests, but actually worked in the interest of an employee, or particularly a journalist here at any media house?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I have colleagues who have done very well as CHROs and HR leaders in this industry. And in fact, I was speaking to one of them a couple of days back, and unfortunately, they did some great work around the 2009 situation when the Lehman Brothers collapse happened, and the media house actually had to lay off close to more than thousands of people in on their roles, kind of a thing. And this colleague of mine, of course, he wanted anonymity because that's the way they have kept it over the years, kind of a thing. So I'll not name out which media house, but what he was sharing was really the epitome in terms of how things should actually happen. And it was about how how they decided as a management in terms of the respect and the dignity that would be provided to every such person who would be impacted, how it was a thorough process in terms of identifying who are the people who would be let go. It was the CEO and the CHRO actually traveling around the country and meeting up every individual who was impacted and handing over the letters in person, having the conversation. And even, in the process of identifying the people who had to be let go, they sort of considered people who, anyone who was on expected to go on maternity or who was having health issues or big family issues, actually those people were put off the list of people who were actually to be impacted. And even after sharing the letters and ensuring that the right financial support was provided, I think they also did some great stuff around providing opportunities in terms of counseling or connecting them with placement agencies, or the CHRO actually was a single point of contact for anyone who wanted or desired references as they sought out for jobs to study themselves once over again. So I was actually thinking through that, this is possibly the highest bar in which how things should happen. So I'm sure that, there are many hidden stories in terms of where an individual or an organization has actually done great work. And what happens in this kind of a situation is that sometimes a herd mentality emerges. When a tide is flowing in a particular direction, everybody starts going in that direction, which is actually thinking that, can I be doing it differently? Can I make a little difference, which will be much more respectful to my people? I think it's about thinking it, not just following blindly in terms of what's happening, but at least being soulful and being, asking the right questions to self in terms of how can I make a little bit of the difference so that the people can go out with support, the dignity, and with the emotional balance when everything around us is going wrong.
Right. I absolutely hear you on that. And I hope there are other HR media professionals who have joined us today and who might be taking a leap or two out of what you've just said. I think it's also a good time again for us to get back to MJ here. And since we've been hearing a lot about, and you've said so much, in fact, about this whole history of, journalists kind of compromising on their own rights, on their own labor rights, in fact. I'm just wondering, at such a time where we're not seeing such a huge competition anymore, the job market is so lean. Do you expect that unions and this idea of unionizing is sort of gonna get a fresh sort of boost of energy?
I think I just touched upon this point earlier. If you see in the 1950s, the unions were led by the editors. When the press commission was set up, the credit went to an editor by the name of Chalapati Rao. And the IFWJ was full of editors. The main office bearers were all editors. Okay. And if we see this dynamic between leading journalists and the organizations they belong to, that crisis also starts somewhere in the 80s. When there is a distancing, if I give my own experience, I was in the times when Girilal was the editor. Now, he was not a big supporter of unions, but he never interfered in the functioning of unions, But I find that after that generation, as I said earlier, editors also became more and more parts of managements. It was very rare for us to see Girilal Jain step across and go and meet anyone in the management. He never did that. And Shamlal even less. But after that, one found that the relationship changed. And so one dynamic was that there was opposition right from the top itself. Okay. The other thing that happened within unions, there was a lot of this so-called fighting over political lines. And you had, which has now reached farcical proportions of splits within these unions. And there are hundreds of these federations in Delhi, each one running, I don't know, they don't even run shops. They're just there as organizations. So what has happened is that there has been a crisis there at the level of leadership. But I feel the larger thing has been this discrediting of collective bargaining. What I said was the normative code of conduct seems to have become not only for journalists, but amongst the intellect workers, that getting into unions could be a barrier to your progress. That kind of thinking that has developed has got solidified. And we need to counter that, because managements are getting more and more united. If you see in the newspaper industry, the INS is solid. It decides something has to be done, the wage board has to be decided, everyone opposes it. Even those who had implemented it fully went back on it and took back certain aspects which they had implemented. While they are getting more and more united, we find that the employees are getting more and more fragmented. And from factions in unions, they have now become individuals. So unless we find a way of regrouping, we can never match the strength which the managements today have. So that has to be a grouping which the younger generation decides. It need not be the older trade union formation. It could be some other association. It need not be something envisaged
If
by
I could just interrupt you there for a second there. I just wanted to also address this kind of common perception that exists that, for either unions or for any kind of collectivizing, that unless there is some sort of either you have a Press Council of India, or for that matter, Editors Guild, or many of these federations that you may have mentioned, unless you have the patronage of, some of these long-standing institutions and places, it's fairly a fruitless effort.
So the organization of the Press Council of India and Editors Guild, they are toothless bodies. And they wake up from their slumber from time to time, depending on which button is pressed. Suddenly, the Press Council, one find, has reacted to the sackings in Hindustan, in Hindu, but it was in deep slumber for the earlier period. So, and in any case, they don't have any powers. They have only the power to censor, and now even that nobody is carrying in their publications. You censor somebody for some act, and now nobody pays attention to it. So these organizations are basically toothless organizations. They have only paper value. What I'm really talking about is organizations of journalists, organizations of newspaper employees. Earlier we used to have composite unions. That means one union in the establishment which had people from the plant, people from the working journalist section, and the admin and marketing, they would all be together. But as I said, in the 80s, when you got in this new technology, that disruptive technology came in the 80s, late 80s, which also led to contract system. It also led to a smashing of the composite unions and the physical displacement of the press. Earlier, the press, as I said, would be in the same building. Today, if you see in Delhi, most of the presses are in Noida. If you see in Bombay, the press will all be in New Bombay. They'll be in some land given by the government at the throwaway prices. They have set up a press. Technology allows them to do this. You just press a button in the modem and you've got the paper with you. So we need to look at these things also in conjunction. You know, the new technology, changing relations, and constant attacks from managements to change the relations in their favor. So what we are seeing now is basically an attack to get journalists into the casual mode, away from even contracts. I'm repeatedly saying, and now the move is to get them into the casualized mode. Like you see, only 3% of the working force in India is organized. The rest is all in casual mode. So we are seeing this push there, and to expect therefore some high-sounding HR person to come and give us some we are sorry, we are sacking you kind of approach. It's not on. They're very aggressive, and that is the aggression of Indian capital as a whole, and that has to be seen in terms of what is happening since neoliberalism. These things are happening not unconnected with what is happening to the world at large. You have to see it within a particular context. That's why I always say that we need to see things at three levels: the practical level, the emotional level, and the philosophical level. If only we grasp the problem at these three levels, do we really have a chance to take a stand and do something which makes an impact.
Okay, right. Thank you so much. Yeah, Mr. Somnath, again, I'd like to bring you in here. I think there are a lot of journalists that I've spoken to over the course of a few days. They're kind of right now in this conundrum, and I'm sure, MJ knows about this very well. He's quite tuned into this. About that, they're at this juncture where they're essentially waiting to get that official email from their HR or their management, right? And the call that they have to take right now is whether should they agree to take, go the termination route, or should they actually, as the management wants, resign? What would you say as an HR consultant today? How would you advise them?
Yeah, so again, out here, I would suggest that we don't look at it as a one size fits all. I would possibly suggest that please assess it based on how you think operates, or what the culture, or what's been the kind of practice in the agency that you are from. Of course, like I said, there's a herd mentality which is going on. Everybody's trying to follow a particular direction at this point of time. But if you feel that there is a way to break in, have some communication, let's not assume that all communication channels are broken. They may be in a dormant state. If there is a possibility to open up and at least get some conversation done, that might be a more a good way to pursue, or an appropriate thing to pursue. That there are different networks which run in an organization. Of course, there is a formal network, which is the CEO or the actual manager, or even through HR. But there are various other trust networks, friend networks, which work in an organization. Sometimes, if a particular network has been purposely or is closed out because intentionally or because of whatever reasons, there may be other networks which are possibly there, which you can tap in and see whether certain communication channels can be opened out to understand and possibly reach a more amicable solution rather than end up in a situation where communication is completely broken off, and there is like, okay, I just need to sign this off, or I don't know what to do else, kind of thing. So yes, that would be one of the advice that I would personally want to share. Look at your own organization and decide what works best for you. The second thing, of course, is that, the law is, that's an unfortunate thing, which was being highlighted by Mr. Pandey, is that also that the Indian law is pretty convoluted and there are so many overlaps kind of a thing. So it's not really detailed out kind of a thing in what approach is the best approach kind of. And that's, I think, a flaw which has been exploited also in certain cases. Of course, today, if somebody is not signing off the letter of the severance or the package which is being given, or the way the person is being laid off in a certain timeline, the company holds the right to terminate the person. And we also have to see how some of these things have been written down in the contracts that were signed, accepted at the time of being hired. And sometimes, just to get on a job, we sometimes fail to read through what kind of legal protectionism we have in case we are hit with a crisis. So sometimes the contracts are also designed unfavorably for an employee in this moments of crisis. So some of those, again, I would suggest that please check it out in terms of, say, looking at your own contracts and see what's the kind of legal cover or the protectionism that you have and what you signed off. Maybe we'll be much wiser retrospectively the next time you sign off an offer letter, but what's been done is read through it and see what was agreed to. And finally, sometimes it's also about not burning the bridges, because there could be a situation that as we come through the trough, things start opening up. There could be a possible, when the demand goes up again, there's a possible, a need for your kind of skills and capabilities. So one of the things we do suggest people is that it's a good idea not to burn all the bridges in a moment of crisis. Keep channels open so that, when things open out, there's a way to bounce back. So I would possibly suggest that, assist some of these factors in as you make your own decision as to what your next steps would be.
Correct. There are quite a few questions which I think are very relevant for both MJ and Somna to take up.
First of all, I think general HR conversation in the context of journalists is actually irrelevant. There is a specific law in place. Without its understanding, to talk of journalism is pointless. There is no other profession which has a working journalist act equivalent. This is because this profession has a certain role in the very essential functioning of democracy. We cannot comment on the HR relations of this industry without understanding this role. It is not a transferable process that you can bring from other industries, from Britannia to Times of India, which is what has happened. This is a different industry with different rationale for operating at its very basis. Okay, given that, we have done ourselves a lot to undermine our own rights. And that process, if that redressal is not taking place, rather than our being able to ask for our rights, we are actually in the process of defending them desperately. The first question that is being raised constantly about contracts, I think MJ has raised this. I fought on a contract and won the case. Simply, I'll just read it out for everybody working in print. There is a simple operative issue, 16(2) of the Working Journalist Act. What does it say? Let me just read it out to you. It says, nothing contained in this act shall be construed to preclude any newspaper employee from entering into an agreement with an employer for granting him rights or privileges in respect of any matter which are more favorable to him than those to which he would be entitled under the act. Now, the huge issue here is people think just because they've entered a contract in some measure gives them better terms than the Working Journalist Act does not mean they lose their rights under the Working Journalist Act. The contract, any contract that diminishes your rights from the Working Journalist Act is an illegal. A single Times of India would have problems if there are 3 to 4 journalists who go and challenge us. The point is, it doesn't happen. Those are some of the reasons that MJ has outlined. The second thing that has not happened is, and we must go back and look at our own colleagues in various industries. First is editors themselves who see themselves as managers rather than journalists. But it is also, there is an entire TV industry that had come up under the presumption that TV journalists are a class apart in the beginning, high wages, high salaries, not accountable under the same system, journalists apart in some senses. We've had now 20 years. It's only when the TV industry and as the digital industry is being hit, do they remember acts like the Working Journalist Act? I have been looking around and asking for some people, prominent digital journalists or prominent television journalists, to actually go appeal to the court, and we worked out the legal grounds for this. There are very valid legal grounds for saying this, the Working Journalist Act must extend to that. You cannot discriminate among journalists simply because one is in print and one is on television. Instead of this happening, what is the state we are in? The new labor codes are actually diluting or doing away with some of the essential provisions of the Working Journalist Act. We are not at the moment mounting a challenge to that. We don't even realize what is happening under those things. When we do not inform ourselves, we do not take consonance of the law, we do not wish to inform ourselves of our rights, and then we return to these rights only when a crisis like the one that is with us hits us, where sackings are taking place. And in the 5 to 7 or 10 years when we've all worked in our jobs where we had the security to do something about, we didn't do it, we are not going to be able to make changes. This is an ongoing, continuous process which has to be dealt with all the time. Part of what MJ has said, and we've tried this very hard, that there have to be some new forms of cooperation and organization among journalists to be able to resist the challenges. But we are not seeing any signs of it. It's very difficult to catalyze it. The old union model is not working too well because of various reasons MJ has pointed out. We don't have a new model. It is leaving individuals facing organizations. It's a losing battle. And actually, HR has, given the way HR shapes the media industry, no meaningful role in it apart from acting as a hatchet job for management. That is simply what it is.
I'll bring in a few questions here, even though this is a bit out of our sequence of events, but I'll still bring in a few questions here because we're really in the thick of this conversation right now, and it seems really most relevant. So we've got one question coming in from, I think, Shillong. In a small organization like Shillong Times, where there is no HR and the BOD consists of family members, how does an individual handle situations like arbitrary pay cuts?
Addressed to me?
You can take it up. This is not specified to anyone, so I think you'd be best to answer this.
The question of pay cuts is quite clear. There is no provision under law to cut the wages, right? So what happens is, unless there is an inquiry and you're found guilty, and maybe then your increment can be stopped as a punishment. But otherwise, in the Working Journalists or in the Industrial Disputes Act, there is no specific provision for just arbitrarily cutting the wages during any kind of crisis. So what needs to be done is, the particular person needs to raise a demand with the company that you have deducted my wages. This is without any reason. This is without any basis in law. And so you please restore my salary. If that salary is not restored, then the cause for him is to write to the labor commissioner, the local labor commissioner, and ask him to intervene in the matter. And then he will start conciliation proceedings. That is the way in which he has to proceed.
Yeah, Mr. Pandey mentions union and role of editors. I want to know, what is the role of PCI? Can I take up cases of layoff or other crisis suo motu? Another one for you, legally speaking, do umbrella unions that are not specific to a company have a locus standi in fighting individual cases? Then there's another question from S. Rajagopal. I would like to hear from MJ or Hartosh on whether resigning or waiting for termination is the right way, something that we addressed earlier with Somnath. And another one from Indu, if your contract mentions you're some version of digital content creator instead of sub-editor, etc., are you still entitled to the rights under the Working Journalist Act?
The first one is golden rule, never resign. Golden rule is never resign. Once you resign, you're forfeiting all your rights. Okay. Then if you change your mind, then you'll have to start with, why did you resign in the first place? So the onus will be on you. So first thing is, don't resign. Let them sack you. See what they give you when they sack you. See whether they're giving you all the dues which you are to get under the Working Journalist Act and the ID Act. And then you make your move. Okay. Once you resign, you've accepted whatever they've given you. And then if some person gets up in the middle of all this and says, no, I've been chipped, then it's going to be very tough, because you'll have to start with that the resignation was obtained under duress or forcibly obtained. All those things will have to be gone into. So my advice to everybody is, no matter what, don't resign. Okay? Because in any case, under the Act, Working Journalists Act, you have to get a service letter. Even if you're terminated, you have to get a letter that you've served in the company. So you're not harmed in any case. And there aren't too many jobs in any case floating around as far as I've understood in journalism. The other point that what was the other question that you made? Can unions take up matters? Or was that one?
Yeah, do umbrella unions that are not specific to a company have a locus standi in fight individual cases?
See, if you go under the ID Act, the question will be whether your grouse has been espoused by other fellow workers or not, at least some fellow workers or not. So if you are the only member of that union, then there's going to be a problem. But if there are 15, 20 members in that union from your establishment, then it shouldn't be a problem. There's no problem to take it up. But you can't be the only member of a union and go there, because it has to be espoused by a group of workers for the Industrial Disputes Act. Yeah.
There is another one which I think
severance pay is not mentioned in your contract.
Yes.
See, as Hartosh has pointed out, I've also pointed out earlier that this whole contract business is a fraud. All it needs is for someone to stand up and say that this is illegal under the law of the land. So whatever rights are available to wage board workers under the Act are also available to contract employees. So if you are an editor, you should be entitled to 6 months notice. If you're a working journalist who is not an editor, 3 months. No matter whether the tenure is contract or, as I tell you, there's no tenure like contract in law. I took you through the Working Journalists Act. I took you through the model standing orders. They don't have that tenure at all. It's a tenure which has been created but has not been challenged. So when your contract is terminated, you can easily fight a case saying that this from ab initio, this contract was illegal. And you are entitled to whatever is available to you under the Working Journalists Act and the Wage Board. In fact, all these people who have been terminated, the further point I want to make to develop this, is all these people who are being terminated, if they give their resignations, they're going to wash their hands of whatever was due to them under the Wage Board. See, now I'll just give you a quick thing of the contract. The people who are not on contract, there's no problem at all about that. But the people who are on contract from 2014 onwards, when the Supreme Court upheld the Wage Board, they were entitled to variable pay at various rates from 2011 itself. No matter what your contract said, if you were in group 1 to 4, you were get variable pay at the rate of 35% your basic. If you are in classes 5 to 8, you were to get variable pay at the rate of 20%. So once you give a resignation, you will not have a chance even to claim this money. And to top this, on June 17th, 2017, the Supreme Court, the then Justice Ranjan Gogoi, he passed an order saying that the contract employees are entitled to all the benefits as are available to the others. This is para 26 of that judgment. So you can even make an application to get all these benefits. So you understand what is actually happening. The trigger point is not this. The trigger point is the judgment of 2014. Because we in Bombay have filed cases for people who are on contract, people who have retired on contract, and we have filed cases. And now those cases are coming to fruition. And once that happens, there will be an avalanche of cases claiming these dues. So you need to understand that even the contract employees are, entitled to a whole lot of benefits, as they would like to call it, goodies, and they have not claimed those goodies. They're there for the asking, the low-hanging fruit. They have not been claimed because of the fact that if you claim it, your contract will not be renewed. But from 2011 onwards, anyone who was on contract should get everything that the others got. You may have got extra reading allowance, travel allowance, all that. But if you're not getting elements of what are described and recommended in the wage board, you can make claims for that. And no one has challenged this order of 2017. Remember, this remains unchallenged, this order. And it's a Supreme Court order. So you just have to make an application, due process of law.
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly take up one last question for this segment because it's quite interesting and I think very relevant to a lot of jobs which have come up on the trending desk of mainstream media especially. So here Indu asks if your contract mentions you're some version of digital content creator instead of sub-editor, etc. Are you still entitled to the rights under Working Journalists Act?
See, the crucial question here is not what you are described as. You may be described as, some executive position you may be given. But the crucial thing is to pierce the veil, as they say. Pierce the veil of the designation and see what you actually do. So if you are performing the functions of a sub-editor, then you will be declared to be a sub-editor. So you will have to lead evidence on the nature of your work, specific nature of your work, what you do from day to day. And from there, it will be determined what you do. Because if you see, there is a whole panoply now of designations which journalists get, and you have to really figure out and think as to what these guys do. So in that sense, you have to pierce the veils of these designations and figure out what, if they're doing the job of a sub-editor, then they're sub-editors. It's very clear. The case from Kerala, I just want to mention, they've gone overboard on his contract. They say that you are responsible for all the creative work, you are the supervisor, you are the manager. They've used one entire paragraph to ensure that he comes out of the purview of a workman. Okay, but that will not help them because he was a special correspondent. That is the work he was doing. So just because the management says you will do this, you will do that, you will be heading this, you will be heading that, if then day to day you were just going and collecting news and filing your dispatches, you will be a special correspondent. Therefore, that evidence on the nature of your work will have to be laid.
I think I will have to move on to the remaining two questions of the panelists, and because they are very actually important topics for us to also touch upon as a part of this webinar. Hartosh, I've been speaking again to a lot of journalists who've recently been laid off, and a lot of them have also touched upon this nepotism, of course, that has existed in the industry for as long as we can recall. A lot of them also, in fact, said that this wasn't just about who your godfather in the industry is or who your actual father in the industry is, but also how useful, this word that useful you are to the management, or how useful you have been to the management. Essentially, you've written I think you've written a piece a while back in the Caravan about a lot of these summits that are organized by youth organizations, and how journalists are often asked to kind of make all the high profile invites and everything. So I think in this scheme, and not to mention, I don't want to at all leave out the fact that, without a doubt, caste has always played an important but silent factor in a lot of, designations, in the kind of profiles and, beats that you get to handle. So with these layoffs in mind, and also the inequalities that are happening within these layoffs, do you kind of foresee some sort of reckoning happening in the Indian media soon? Just as we're witnessing, in fact, right now in the American media, with the Black Lives Matters movement going on, and of course, with all of the layoffs that are happening in the American media industry right now.
See, 2-3 things. One is, let's not compare ourselves with the American media. For people to be able to speak up within the media, you need structures very different from the ones we have. The insecurity of jobs, say what happened in the New York Times newsroom cannot happen in any of the newsrooms in this country, because we don't have those systems in place. We don't have the laws in place. We don't have that culture in place. This question of nepotism, godfathers, it is to do with how Indian news organizations are run as basically personalized systems. I'm talking of good ones and bad ones. You take 1 or 2 people out of those places and the whole character of an organization changes. So if there are no systems of recruitment, what is the basis on which you recruit, who you interview, what is the criteria used for selection, there will be no criteria in terms of dismissals as well, because it will be favoritism, who you got to know, who wants you in. As long as you don't have systems in place across the board, you are going to see the effects of those lack of systems in the dismissals themselves, and they will reflect everything you said. Nepotism, contacts, favoritism, caste, gender, all these will come out to play at this point of time. The people who are most vulnerable, who don't have these protections, will be the first to go because they can make the least noise. Which is why I will just echo, because some of the questions had been asked, do not resign in the haste of the moment when pressure is being put on you. There is a need to go back clear-headedly, take that decision. As for the various questions about the kind of work you do, it does not matter. You will be led through it in any court. As a political editor, I was told I was a manager, and I had to justify. Eventually, I had to file 3,000 words of the material I had written for Open Magazine. I was the single largest contributor for the magazine in front of the court. So yeah, the process is not an easy process, but it is there. In this context, I think, should I just take up some of the other questions that are there? Because I think it's important for individual journalists, questions about freelancers, etc., or should we come back to that basically?
I would want to come back to freelancers because I have something that I have addressed to, Tanya, for that. But however, if there's anything else that you'd want to address, there is one question from, I think it's addressed to Mr. Pandey, but it's something that you could also perhaps, consider. It's from Rakhi. She says, I've never resigned from TT. I'm guessing that's the Telegraph, but still they didn't give me any termination letter. No 3 months notice, no gratuity. Even after 10 years, nothing really happens, even if you don't resign.
The question is, when we are saying don't resign, it means that you're willing to go battle out for what is your right in some senses. The threat of process is what an organization is holding up against you. Process in India is always going to be difficult. It is going to be challenging. That is the fright that they hold out before you, that if you do not do this right now at this moment, we will make you run through the hoops and not give you what you want. And what I'm saying is that, yes, I cannot at any individual level justify saying, no, you should not do it. What I'm saying is that if enough people stop doing it, this pressure that the management exerts will automatically disappear. And I'm not saying enough people needs to be everybody, 2 or 3 out of each sacking. If they are willing to challenge it, you will soon find that this whole arbitrary process will disappear. It is like, if we are going to accept this each time, it is like a herd running away every time there is a threat, rather than gathering together and taking on the threat. And that needs just 2 or 3 people. There is no other solution. We can keep talking for as long as we want, but unless there are a few people willing to stand up and take on the questions that are necessary and ask for what is due to us legally and as our rights, we will not get it.
Right, right. I think because we also want to address quite a few of the freelancer questions here, and that is clearly the, the thing that everyone's going to be getting into in this situation. My last question to Dhanya. Dhanya, you're still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, all right. Okay, great. So I think this is something that's, as a freelance journalist, as an independent journalist, again, I have been very grateful as well as very fortunate, to have a lot of news websites to work with in a freelance capacity. And a lot of these websites, in fact, like yours have built like an excellent body of reportage, through this network of freelance journalists all across the country who've actually made that, a lot of whom have actually made that choice a few years, back, to just write stories independently from the ground, without any fear or favor or sort of any kind of, editorial influence from the editors. So what would be your advice to a lot of these journalists who are facing this kind of imminent job loss? Like, do you think that independent journalism may be the only model left for these times? And also, if that is the case, then how can digital portals also support them better?
See, there are really 2 parts to the question, Makepeace. First is independent journalism better? As far as doing stories are concerned, definitely, I think independent journalists have done much better work in the last couple of years than journalists working with organizations. Also because there are no time constraints as far as organizations are concerned. There are too many deadlines you have to follow. Then there are other patronages in the organization that most journalists abide by. So yes, as far as work is concerned, many independent journalists have shown that they can do spectacular work when they are not part of any organization. But what happens if those independent journalists have to face legal trouble or any other kind of trouble for the articles that they write? Then what happens? I think as an editor, I'm just saying that if you are writing an article which can either have legal repercussions or any other kind of repercussion, even before publishing, that conversation should take place with the editor. It should preferably be a written conversation, asking the organization what their responsibilities are, how will they support you if something goes wrong, especially if there is going to be a case filed, most probably if there's going to be defamation or any sort of case, how will the organization help you? These are things which have to be talked to with the editor of that organization. And as far as the finances go, would it be better to work as an independent journalist now? Again, I'm only speaking as someone who runs an organization. The last 2 or 3 weeks, I have got so many emails, so many messages, requests from people I know, from journalists I admire who have lost their jobs and they want to freelance. And I really want to help each of them write stories. But the point is, I myself have to conserve money to run the organization, and I cannot then engage with too many freelance journalists. So it's really a catch-22 situation where I understand that they need help from us, but many organizations are not, like the smaller organizations like us, simply don't have money now to pay freelance journalists. So maybe the bigger organizations will have, but I don't know. I think next 2 or 3 months, most freelance journalists are going to find it difficult to even get paid for the work that they do. I'm just being very candid here. So even if you're writing for someone, please ask them. For example, when we started taking articles initially, it was a very haphazard system wherein sometimes I would even forget that someone wrote an article and the payment would not be done. Then we streamlined the process. We have a proper invoice now, which people have to fill and send it to us. So the onus is also on them, that they have to fill that invoice and send it to us, and then we make the payment. So now I think another few months, if you are going to be freelancing for organizations, please have the money conversation even before you give that article.
Yeah, certainly. And I think there's a question here, which is something that I know certainly ranted on Twitter about. Ninglon Hangal from Imphal asked about the freelancers who have no ID cards. And especially in this time of curfew and lockdown, mobility being a problem, that's certainly been a issue for a lot of freelance journalists to obtain any kind of, even a temporary press card basically from the organizations and the websites or any other places that they usually write for. So these are the kind of places where I think, freelancers are really looking for very, very clear answers, I suppose, from editors and from news organizations.
You want to speak about the ID cards? I mean, I've been seeing a lot of...
That's clearly been a huge elephant in the room for the longest time.
So I'll just quickly tell you what, for example, when I was working in Times Now, initially they used to give ID cards to all freelancers. For example, any freelancer from any district, they were given ID cards. But there was one time when the freelancer had blackmailed someone or asked for money and used the ID card, which is when that organization decided that no freelancers will get ID cards. So this is a reason why many big media houses do not give ID cards, because first thing, you are then responsible for any act which that freelancer does, right? So they do not give any ID cards. And I think that's acceptable to a large extent. Now, the other thing is, for example, I know you. If you want to freelance for me and you need an ID card, I give that on a very personal basis. But as an organization, can the News Minute be giving ID cards to every freelancer we engage? No, that's very difficult. Simply because the responsibility is on us on what they do, right? But as far as I'm concerned, I do give letters. If people are going for some coverage, I give a letterhead to some of the freelancers we have given ID cards, because we've had some connection with them which is being spread across years. So I think it's more of a personal relation which the editor has, but maybe Hartosh can also speak about it. I don't know if organizations can give ID cards as such. And in digital, we don't have ID cards ourselves. Like, digital is not recognized by most state governments. We don't have any accreditation. Some of us use the old accreditations that we had when we were working for TV channels. So it's not just freelancers. Digital media as such is not recognized by most state governments or the central government itself.
Right. Hartosh, would you like to add it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so we are a print organization which is basically hugely now focused on the digital space. So I understand some of these issues. I mean, when we look at the question of freelancers, we also have to address something of what MJ said, that there is an ecosystem that is largely increasing of casual laborers. Whether that is right or wrong is a different question. It is also, some people are making these choices, some people are being forced to make those choices. How do we make that as reasonable a position as possible, a reality that already exists? No organization is doing it too well. I am not claiming any great credit for ourselves. Payments, when there is a payment crisis, there is a hierarchy in which our own staffers, their payments are taken care of first and then freelance payments are made. There's a huge lag which should not be there, which I can't justify, but it's just a practical problem that we cannot find our way around in terms of money flows that are happening at this point of time, or even earlier. In terms of IDs, part of the reason is what Dhanya just said. We try and differentiate. We already have been doing. Now we are trying to formally systemize. We use journalists who are doing long form stories for us, working with us for 3-4 months on a story, interacting with us. And yes, in those cases, we have been issuing caravan IDs, and we want to formalize that system. There are also people who will be put on a series of stories commissioned for the web where we want to formalize this. But if there is a story that has come to us as a story which we've accepted it, done the checks, run it, what we will do is that we will back that story up legally in every which way, because we've run the checks. It's our responsibility. If there is any legal trouble for anybody with or without contract, it is our responsibility to defend that. But can we hand out an ID in that context, in those circumstances? Is very difficult. What happens to legal liability? How do we take legal liability for people where we have not run background checks, where we don't know what is happening? How do we work under these circumstances? These are real issues. I'm not saying that it does not create an imbalance, but as organizations, it's not easy to find a way around these also. We are struggling with it and we are trying to do what we can. Sometimes it's not very good, I admit it. We would like to systemize a process and put a process in place where we can say, here are the people who can get freelance IDs, this is the criteria, this is how we will do it. And we are trying to get there in some ways.
Proffer a comment on this?
Sure, go ahead.
Having dealt with it, not from the editor's desk, but from the other side, what I feel is perhaps when you assign a freelancer to do a particular assignment, you can give a kind of letter saying that he has been assigned by the establishment to work on this story. So it gets limited to that particular assignment. I think, there's some, whatever you need to work out for that, so that at least specifically you don't cross any, boundaries which you have set for yourself as far as that individual is concerned. But in the pursuit of that assignment, at least his way is smoothened. That could be a short step towards protecting that person.
I would actually rebut that point, MJ, because I mean, I was anyway going to chip in with my own experience as a freelancer who's been now doing this full time since at least 2017. Like even during times of like protests and curfews and lockdowns, I mean, I can recall my experience from the anti-CA protests here in Guwahati, and which was a very, very violent one. I mean, I had to take great risk to go around and sort of report and persuade all these protesters who are blocking roads to let me pass and things like that. And in that situation, their first thing is, can you show us your ID card? And I mean, in a lot of other volatile situations, I don't think, especially also in dealing with with authorities and with the police, in fact, I don't think a letter is of incredible use. To be very honest, because you're often also standing at a distance and you're actually asking. I mean, you're actually trying to. I mean, you don't have you don't have one of those press badges or something like that. You don't have one of those little vests that you're wearing, which has a press kind of printed all over it or something. So in that situation, like, even just flashing a distance really help. I mean, they're not really going to be bothered to come and read a letter like up close and see the fine details of your assignment, who you're writing for. And I would say my experience at that time with quite a few organizations who had already been writing for quite some time and who knew me in person as well, was not very, like, I wouldn't say it was very like reassuring, because despite, the years that we knew each other and the number of pieces that I'd written for them, they weren't very forthcoming as far as offering any ID. And I thought that was a bit disappointing, considering the fact that, I was doing my utmost best to kind of, report from the front lines. So I think that's something that I do want to add. The other bit is that as far as...
Just let me respond to that. There's a confusion of categories. You are now talking about stringers. People like you may be stringing regularly for somebody. The stringer would be entitled to an identity card. But when we talk about freelance, we basically, a freelance would be a person who sells an idea to an editor that, okay, I want to work on this and I'd like to do this. And the editor would give his assent and then would work on that story. That is my, this idea of what freelance activities.
Yeah,
if you're doing regularly work for somebody, then you'd be a stringer and you'd be entitled to an iCard. No problem with that.
I think the difference is a bit the same. I mean, I understand obviously the roles might slightly differ, but nevertheless, a lot of freelance journalists who are actually writing the stories and not just collecting the information are in fact now and then afforded a ID card on special assignment. So that does happen. It's not entirely unheard of, so to speak. But the one thing that I did want to add about formalizing systems, because I do write for international publications as well, they typically always have a contract that you sign, like, prior to beginning the reporting or the writing of the piece, in which that everything is sort of very clearly mentioned, sort of hashed out, everything is mentioned. There is a kill fee that is often also in fact mentioned. So that's another issue that I can speak, as a freelancer and on behalf of many freelancers, that when stories don't quite work out, or for that matter, the findings or the reportage or maybe even just the writing doesn't quite, match up to the standards of a particular publication, a lot of that effort can often just go to waste without any kind of remuneration. So I feel definitely a contract being part of this formalizing system would certainly be helpful for both parties. Dhanya, you wanted to add something?
No, I said, see, there is no formal system as such, but I agree with Mr. Pandey. To stringers, yes, most organizations do give ID cards. The problem is for freelancers. What do you do with freelancers who may engage with you once in a year, once in 6 months? How do you protect them? Which is very problematic. Most organizations don't want to give ID cards, which is why they stick to just giving letters.
Right, one thing, I think even in freelancers, I think the distinction I was trying to make is between stories that are commissioned, where we certainly need to make sure we are giving ID cards out there and find a way to do it. And we are working towards it, because absolutely, if we are trusting a journalist to do a story, then we are trusting them to behave in a manner that we would expect our journalists to behave. But what do we do in terms of stories that have contributed to us, which have landed up? That is where the question rises. When we use a story, it's a story of certain immediacy. What are the processes that we go through apart from running just good journalism? So I think there is a distinction, at least in that category, of whether those are commissioned stories, contributed stories, and how we deal with the two. With the commissioned stories, I don't think there's any issue at all. We all agree that there has to be a better process. We are trying to find a way of how we work with the contributed stories and how we formalize that in some senses. And yeah, we failed largely in that, absolutely.
Yeah, I think certainly, and I don't think that unnecessarily any freelancer out there will necessarily demand I need a press card because I'm going to cover some cultural event, or some sort of non-hostile show or whatever story or something. Yeah, sorry, can you come again, Dhanya?
Jatin has made Indian newsrooms need to issue short duration contributor ID cards.
I think Tanya might have frozen. She may have logged off. Yeah, I think the same point has also been, reflected by Banuj Kapal in high-intensity situations. Even journalists with press cards have been getting detained. So I don't see a letter from the editor offering much protection, which is just, well, of course, the reality. But as I said, a bit about formalizing the system, and of course using discussion. I do not disagree on that point that yes, not every person who's going to go cover a story or just gonna land up with a draft necessarily requires or should be given a press card. So but certainly with given the intensity of the story and the report that they're aiming to do, I think that's something that's a call that certainly should be taken a bit more generously, I think, from the editors. I'll get in one comment from Meera. She's the editor of Citizen Matters. Her apart discussion about legal issue. One input: when we get an article that could be controversial or legally risky, we run it through our legal advisor before publishing. This helps the writer, freelancer, in-house. Is it something that, would you say that all of you in your capacity as editors also kind of make it as a mandatory part of the process, of the editorial process, in fact?
Yes.
Sorry, Dhanya, go ahead.
Yes, of course.
Well, look, we are legally responsible for everything we publish in any case. I mean, so the idea that we could write a disclaimer there and put the attribution on the contributor is just not true, and we never do that. Everything that passes through our process and gets published is our responsibility, which means providing legal backup, anything else that goes with that story. If we published it and there are problems with the piece, that's our problem, not the person who sent the piece to us. We have to run through our checks. As far as CCI, I mean, it's quite simple, but it's not a principle that's universally applied, unfortunately. I've seen over and over again, major sites running pieces with disclaimers saying this is the author's this or something, we are not accountable. That is not then a journalistic job that you're doing. You can't be doing that.
I mean, that is only reserved for opinion pieces, right? As far as I know.
I said, no, I will show you many reported pieces where they don't want to back up the reporting because reporting checks are not held. So they put the responsibility on the reporter, and I will pull out some of these. I would not want to name organizations, but it's become an issue wherever they want to run stories against the government and not take responsibility for it. On the few occasions they actually dare do that, they want to have a disclaimer running along with it.
Mm-hmm. I think there's one question for MJ, and with that we could look to wrap up. But I think just before we get into that, Hartosh, I was wondering if you're facing the same issue because if we are talking about layoffs and talking about media budget cuts, how badly this is going to affect like even freelancers. Like we're looking at permanent employees going the freelance way, but I mean the freelance industry itself is kind of like
We have already had, in a staggered manner, pay cuts at Caravan because there was no other option. It is because there's an entire group that we deal with. Fortunately, in some senses, Caravan itself, because we had well before this crisis moved to a subscriber model, and our revenues actually are doing very well. They're not any longer ad dependent. So there is not that immediate crisis of survival in any real sense. Actually, we are hoping to expand as we go along and build on that. But yes, cash flow has become a huge issue. Our own wages are late in some senses through the month, and it is going to have a staggered impact on payments that are pending, which have already been delayed, absolutely. Not only that, our ability to commission at the same scale at which we were operating in terms of freelancers, it's not as if we will stop doing that, but it's come down considerably. And over the next 3-4 months may, as Dhanya said, come down even further because there are large issues which are outside anybody's control, however much we may want it, because what is happening outside there, we may not like the system, but that's the system that is pushing revenues towards us or taking away revenues, and there is no control we have over that environment.
Yeah.
Right. I think there's one more interesting question that's come up, but I will just quickly address this one from Asya Sherwani. What do you think? Why do you think so many toothless organizations, bodies like PCI exist? and what can we do to ensure that we don't have toothless and useless organizations going forward? Her words on mine. So yeah. MJ, would you like to address this?
Really, actually, this is one of the institutions that came up after the first press commission, that is in 1954. They submitted the recommendation, and one of the recommendations was that an institution like this should be set up. But we have found that because it doesn't have any powers apart from that of censure, no one takes it seriously any longer. So that's a kind of difficult issue. Do you want to give the press council authority to actually punish somebody? That is a whole other different debate. You know, these kind of things, when there are laws available under the IPC and now various other acts to take action against delinquents, do you want to give the press council that kind of power? So that debate has yet not been resolved conclusively, even within the community of journalists. That is why things stand as they are. Really, given today's situation, giving power to the press council may be a terrible thing, because all the appointments are political, and they may be picking up somebody every day and giving out all kinds of orders and punishments. So I would say at the moment I would be against empowering the press council further. In this conjuncture, I would be against it.
Right. I think on that ominous note, we'll bring this discussion to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, especially to all the panelists for taking out the time to actually really bring all your, questions and all your points to the fore very frankly and very candidly. And we certainly really appreciate the diversity of views we've got here. There are quite a few, I think, questions which have come in very last moment, but I'm so sorry I do not have actually the time anymore to address them, but I do hope you can take it up on Twitter or any other channels that you might have. The panelists have a view of the chat, so they can certainly also, in fact, somewhere address them on chat or, take this up individually. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much
Thank
again.
you.
Bye-bye.